I'm Dr. Lara Bullock, the curator of Fear No Art, Civic Engagement, Histories, Currencies, and I'm here today speaking with one of the artists featured in the exhibition, Zoya Sardashti. Zoya was born in Denver, Colorado to an American mother and an Iranian father, and she spent most of her childhood in the southern part of the US. She has independently produced performances in Seoul, London, Los Angeles, and Florence. And since 2010, she has operated as creative co-director of Home Soil, a contemporary performance collective interested in staging site-specific performance art in theater, gallery, and club spaces, and mounting public interventions addressing identity politics and human rights issues. Home Soil's mission is to unify artistic experiences with civic participation by creating socially engaged international collaboration. She has a master's in performance and creative research. Currently, she is pursuing a master's of science in conflict management and resolution and a PhD in philosophy, art, and social thought at the European Graduate School. So welcome, Zoya.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, so to begin, can you tell us just a little bit about your background as an artist and how you came to work through the medium of performance?
Sure. I started out training as an actor in the theater, and I also took dance classes and choreography classes, and I really also wanted to direct, but when you're doing an undergraduate degree, you're not allowed to direct for some reason, like you're just allowed to take one class and that's it. And that really was reflective of how the, let's say, industry worked. I felt as if I was ready to start my own company, and where I was like working collaboratively and doing devised theater where people were really being transgressive across multiple disciplines, artistic mediums and multiple disciplines. And when I went to New York City, there wasn't a lot of space to do that, especially people who are from multicultural backgrounds. And it was very, like in the early 2000s, it was very much static, let's just say, to be polite. So I decided that I would start my own company in a different country, which is why I moved to Seoul, because I wanted to learn a different practice. It's like every young theater artist's, dream to go to, the East and like do something different. Or it was also something that theorists were doing in the 60s. So I was like ready to do that, and I did it and realized, wow, theater is very expensive. It's really hard working with lots of people, and I should just try to work as a solo performance artist for a while.
Okay, very interesting. So I can see kind of how, that background kind of informs your work, being familiar with several of your projects since we met a few years back. So your piece in the exhibition Fear No Art, To Be Seen and Unseen, is part of a larger project called Waking Up Iranian. And can you just tell us a little bit about kind of the overall project itself, and then a little bit about its iterations and just kind of how you came to work within these themes?
Sure. I wanted to create a project about the sort of confrontational or the problems when someone confronts you in daily life about your identity, about your history, about your background, which is something that always happened when I was working and living in Korea, because you're already marked as a foreigner, and that was fine. I was like learning that this sort of relational sort of need to defer to other, to understand how to respect another person, was built within like a framework of communication, and like also like bowing, or the way that you hold something and pass something to another person. The body changes in relation to like their background. This was completely different from like my experience growing up in the United States, right? Because where are you from marks you as one, you don't belong here, or you're foreign, or it's a process of othering that excludes. I wanted to address this. And so I started this project in the basement of like my apartment, and it was with two other people. And so that was, and it was for like maybe a duration for an hour. And then I went to graduate school and it changed. And then I went to Europe and it changed. And before I knew it, I had 7 performances under this broader series. So it's one-to-one work, and then there's one performance lecture.
Okay. So why did you come up with the title Waking Up Iranian?
I feel like the drama of politics constantly changes.
Mm-hmm.
So the way I move, the way people perceive me, the way I can see or not see my family members, the way that my friends who are living in other countries are impacted, not just in Iran, but as immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
It's constantly evolving in a way that I don't think is just or right. And so every day you wake up to a new set of relations, and how we deal with this is something that must be collaborative. It just can't be like people talking about politics. It just can't be civil society trying to, get in contact with political elites. And this is why I think art is the space to really be transgressive and create awareness, but also release us from sort of like the cultures of fear that politics puts us in.
Totally. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, to be seen and unseen, the piece in the show, directly, it kind of removes all markers of identity and puts the participant and or both performers kind of on an even playing field. And it's a really interesting experience because, without that, it affects you personally as you're engaging in the performance, but also the way sort of you're perceived kind of moving through space by others who have no idea what's going on. So maybe could you just kind of elaborate a little bit more about on that specific piece, and maybe just kind of reflect or share some interesting experiences you've had when performing it.
Absolutely, thank you. This is a great question. I started this piece when I moved to Florence and in Italy. So I didn't know any Italian. So but Italians are really, the language is embodied. It's, the sort of philosophy is embodied in the architecture. I was just looking at space and bodies in space as the primary sort of not just things to look at because it's beautiful, but ways to see or ways to know or ways to learn. And then language came last. So I would listen and try to put everything into context. So I hear one word or a few words repeated over and over and over again. And then I see, a gesture. And then I'm like, oh, okay, that's what this means. So in a way, I was relying on the body and scenography almost as a way to help me gain access to a language, which is what we do in art, in performance. We create an artistic language somehow with movement and visual components. And two major things happened that really shifted, that brought me into this conversation because people would ask me about it. One, the ban of the veil was happening, I think, in Denmark at that time and in France, the possibility. People really wanted to know my position on that, being both from, Iranian and American heritages. And then also a woman was murdered. Her name is Ashley Olsen, and she was murdered, and the conditions surrounding her murder basically argued that, well, if she hadn't done this with that person, then she wouldn't have died. And it was very clear to me that it didn't matter if you were, let's say, a Muslim woman wanting to do something with her body or an American woman wanting to do something with her body. It seemed like the public had a right to say, oh, you can't do this. You don't have the right to move. And that's why I made this performance, because whether you're covered up or you're completely exposed, whether you come from one part of the world or the other, it's intertwined and it's interrelated, and we can't just say that these two positions are helping us really understand the deeper meaning of freedom.
Very interesting. Very important.
Yes.
So another kind of aspect I sort of touched on already is just the act of walking itself. And you mentioned how the Italian language is embodied, the performance, just performance in general is embodied, but walking, it has a very specific, lineage in relation to contemporary art itself, from the Situationists and the Derive as a form of resistance.
Yes.
Francis Alise, his Paseos, Richard
Mm-hmm.
Long, and, even like earthworks, just
Yeah.
the act of approaching and kind of discovery, walking is central to those as well to some extent. So why did you feel walking was an ideal mode, or why were you drawn to walking as the mode to kind of get to the meaning and behind the performance?
I'm really glad that you brought up the Situationists, because the work that Guy Debord and others, I guess, practiced and then theorized really impacted my thoughts around what performance can do in terms of engage multiple publics, and then it's a form of assembly, right? So the act of walking together marked maybe in a costume that is not, contemporary, read as contemporary, because the costumes were made, I guess, we tried to make them reflective of some of the costuming in the sculptures. There were like Renaissance sculptures that we saw in Florence, but also the garments that my grandmother gave me, these like beautiful clothes that I guess were created. We don't know exactly when they were made, but we know they were made before the Revolution. So there was like this blend, this like, again, a hybridity of costuming that marked us as not in a specific time or place. And the walking was this, like, created this procedural effect where, like, it wasn't a ceremony, it wasn't a parade, but it was a way to reflect on, like, how we other, like when people like were looking at us, even though we had these masks and these costumes, people felt like, I am so exposed. Or like, they noticed that different people that they would never expect to look at them, looked at us. For instance, one woman, there were two women wearing hijabs, and they like looked at us and they laughed and they were so delighted. And this one woman said, who was with me, said, oh, they looked at me. And I said, has that ever happened before? She said, no. And I was like, I wonder if that's how they feel when you look at them. This sort of looking and knowing has to happen somehow in motion. And I knew walking would be a great way to do it, because not only are we like allowed to have this more like freedom of thought as this body circulates within the body of a city, but it opens it up to multiple conversations, because you can go anywhere. So in the performance, I have this sort of like suggested path. But if someone says, as we're holding hands, someone says, I want to go down this alley, I'm like, yes. Yes, we will detour. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that's like another really important piece of the performance as well, that there's not like, while there might be a suggested path, there's not like an end goal. Like we have to start here and we have to end here. Like it's not prescribed. Yeah. And that kind of allows for that freedom, I think, that you're talking about. Yeah. So what would be like, what is the most, like, do you have a story of what was kind of the most interesting reaction you've had from outsiders, I guess, while performing this piece, or from the participant themselves?
It's amazing how simple tools like a mask and a costume can really put a person in a position where they can speak from their body of knowledge and the beauty that just comes out in this conversation. Like, I think I'm being someone else. I am myself, but I'm not yet myself. And I don't think we have enough opportunities to really play with that sort of different modes of communicating, different states of being, like having fun and being playful, rather than going like directly into like, this is who I am, this is how, which is important, very important, but like it makes identity politics, especially during a time when I don't know if it can get, any more heated, more like playful and reciprocal. Yeah. And the most surprising moment during this performance was when two well, they're not police officers, carabinieri. They're like somewhere between like a softer side of the police in Italy. So we were out like holding hands and right by the Duomo, which is the main church. And we were looking up at the sun because we had masks on, and it's made of a certain material that allows you to look at the sun directly. We were like moving and kind of dancing because it's also in this like it was in the square, right? So there was music, and all of a sudden two members of the Carabinieri came up and they're like, "What are you doing?" and we were like, "Oh, this is a performance." And they're like, "Can I try it?" And they pointed to the mask, and I said, "Yes." And they put it on. And so tourists are taking pictures and like, this free documentation right now. But like people are like, so there was like this little performance within the performance going on. And they asked me about it, and I told them briefly what we were doing. And at the time I was doing this performance for the Iranian Studies Women's Conference. And he was like, I said something like kind of joking, like, "Oh, it saves me time and money because I don't have to wear makeup." And he said, "Yes." The officer took off the mask. He said, "Yes, it is like makeup." A mask is like makeup. And I honestly feel like the sort of maybe assumptions I have about a police officer or a man in authority was also interrogated there. Like this person who I think is, a threat to me or like authoritative in some way, it was just like, I understand you, and we're talking about lipstick. And there was a really nice way to know someone even in the moment for a moment.
Wow. So speaking of that, so there's that central component of performance, like the performance itself, but then at the opening of Fear No Art, you had a kind of secondary performance. So just in case listeners, just to kind of repeat, like, so this garment that the two participants in the performance wear becomes sort of like this living document, and because the participant will write like their experience right on the garment, and so since this project has traveled around the globe, it's in multiple languages. So could you maybe speak a little bit about kind of that a little bit more, and then also just the performance that you did at the opening?
Yes, absolutely. So modes of documentation are very important because these sort of traces, these pathways that we take one to one are collected at the bottom part of the garment. So there's the kind of dress I wear, and then there's this cloak that the participant and co-performer wears, and then at the ends, it's detachable. This garment is detachable. So we can use it in other contexts for other reasons. But most of all, people can read previous experiences as like a point of departure for them to write about their own. So I thought, well, why not, if it's a living document, well, why don't we activate it with people at the gallery, right? And in the gallery sometimes we're like, "Oh no, be quiet, don't touch the art." And I'm like completely against this. I'm like, I want you really to leave the traces of like the oils of your fingers, and like if like sweat comes down, that's okay too, because it smudges and it blends the text. And I thought it might be nice for people who maybe it would be too intimate, to do this performance, could somehow engage in this different iteration of the performance. So I asked people who had gathered around the installation, and also I invited people who did this performance with me at the Mesa College's exhibition maybe a year ago. To read, just like pick it up and like kind of see how we could rotate as a group. Everyone like takes a part of the garment and like walk around as a group of the gallery and exit, and then stand in front of the gallery and just read the former performers' experiences in multiple languages, and how that might be a way to also embody a sense of knowing in histories that other people generated in other parts of the world, and that sort of currency of collectivity has like no price tag in terms of value.
Totally. Yeah, it was really cool. It was subtle, like most of your gestures are, I think, and they are personal, and universal at the same time. So, so to be seen and unseen, something I thought was really interesting, like, my most performative art, when I think of performance art, you imagine like, typical, like a theatrical setting with, lots of viewers who have maybe bought a ticket, or they know that they're supposed to show up, and then there is someone performing for them, and we've already talked about how you sort of democratize that relationship through the performance. But it's also just interesting the way in which participants, I don't want to say get to, but like arrive at that, are able to participate. Like they have to contact you directly, and it's kind of private and quiet. So why did you take that approach?
I feel as if we need to think more about care. Mm-hmm. And through care, we establish an ethical relationship that doesn't exist, or is not as frequently practiced. Mm-hmm. And because I feel as if this, like we just live in so many situations where it's just, we repeat cycles of violence, whether we want to or not, right? Whether it's engaging with capitalism or patriarchy. So there's a lot of undoing, mm-hmm. unlearning. And so this sort of like quiet, the softness or the strength in what can be a search for the nuance, really, I think, needs to work within this sort of framework of care, ethics, interdependency. That everything is so loud, mm-hmm. and it's loud by design. And I feel like for resistance, to resist with the body as site of resistance, we start the conversation in a way that is maybe more of a whisper, mm-hmm. And then it grows. And then once we feel comfortable, we're ready to say something stronger in a voice that is louder. And so this sort of framework of using performance to generate an assembly of people is a way to gain trust, to build trust, because we know that social bonds are constantly being severed. And it's a way to really, like, I guess, calm your nervous system, right? Mm-hmm. Because we really do need to think about alternatives to what we've seen in performance art. Historically, people were doing things like bloodletting, and that was necessary in a certain context, or, self-violence to show the larger frameworks of violence. And now I want to subvert that and call for a coexistence of nonviolence.
I love that. Very powerful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having this conversation with me today. And thank you so much for being a part of the exhibition. I'm always honored to work with you. Would you like to share, where can people find out more about your work on social media or website?
Well, first, I'd like to say it's an honor to always be in dialogue with you, Dr. Bullock. I wish I could have a conversation one day a week with you, because that would push me to be a better artist and writer and theorist.
Likewise.
If we don't have these opportunities, and we don't have them enough, we can't evolve as a community, as a scene, as a nation of empowered, well-informed artists. So first, thank you. And to answer your question, people may view my work and the work that others made with me, mm-hmm. On my website, which is homesoil.org. I will be working on some exciting projects in January. So if you want, you can also email me at homesoilprojects@gmail.com.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.